We're speaking with Catalina Vicens, who is a keyboardist and early music specialist. She's joining us from Bologna, Italy, but she'll be here in the Northwest on Sunday, March 16th, playing an organetto alongside Trio Mediæval in a program called An Old Hall Ladymass. Catalina, it's great to meet you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're from Santiago, Chile, originally. You're the daughter of an opera singer. You learned piano at a young age. How did you get interested in early music?
Well, I always liked the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Even as a child, playing piano and listening to lots of choral music concert or orchestral concerts, I heard lots of Bach. And then I became quickly interested in what was coming before the music of Bach or the repertoire that I knew as a pianist. So basically, that's how I got interested in it. But I always, actually, since I was 13 years old, I was a new music lover. So I had interest on the different repertories that meant sound exploration in a way.
We'll talk about new music, including new music on old instruments like the one you're bringing to Seattle, which we call a portative organ in English. But first, what's different about this instrument than other old keyboard instruments?
So this type of instrument, in difference of the other historical keyboards where there's surviving exemplars of them. For example, harpsichords today, most of them are based on surviving instruments from 500, 400, 300 years ago. Or some of the historical larger organs are based on historical antique instruments. The portative organ doesn't survive. So there's no instruments from the Middle Ages that have survived. And this little portable organ is reconstructed today or basically built anew through different little bits of sources such as paintings in iconography where we see them, some documentation. And so this is this medieval portative organ.
So it's a modern copy of an old instrument. I'm going to describe it for our radio listeners. It's in a wooden case, about 1 foot deep, 2 feet wide, with a keyboard in front and a fireplace-style bellows in back, roughly the size of a toy piano, except that it's got 2 rows of tall metal pipes sticking out the top. It really does look like a miniature pipe organ. How much does it weigh?
Between 13 and 16 kilos,
So about 30, 35 pounds,
more
not
or less.
exactly lightweight.
Not extremely, yeah.
And these instruments were in use from the 13th through the 16th century.
That's when they were the most popular from the 13th, late 13th to the 15th centuries. In the 16th century, they basically disappear from all Europe. That's why we don't have any surviving instruments. The fashion with the Renaissance, with the 16th century changes so much. The tuning systems change. So this instrument appears completely lost after this period.
Were they made obsolete by the big, permanently installed cathedral organs?
Not really, because bigger organs were always there. So the medieval portative organ is not a predecessor. It's not like the grandfather of the large organ. They lived simultaneously throughout the late Middle Ages and probably before, also because the organ has a quite long history that we often forget. But the use probably is what the function that it had in society. It was a processional instrument. It was most likely tuned in Pythagorean for the type of music, Pythagorean tuning system, basically with pure fifths. And by the 15th century, this system starts becoming an only theoretical system and less of a practical system, especially when you start adding 3, 4, 5 or more voices into polyphony.
Pythagorean tuning also starts to falter as the music gets more chromatic.
Exactly, and especially it makes the thirds extremely dissonant. So the music until, let's say, the mid late 15th century is in a great part based on a resolution of the chords of your phrases, which is only containing a fifth and the octave.
Uh-huh.
There are lots of thirds and sixths throughout and other intervals, and they are much more dissonant than later tunings. So that's why we hear lots of spice in most of the music, and then a resolution which is as pure as it gets.
Now, you don't play exclusively old music on this instrument. You've also had living composers write music for you. In the background, we're hearing a piece by the Thai composer Patch Bundi Schoolchok from your solo album Organic Creatures. What's it like playing contemporary music on such an archaic instrument?
Well, one of the fascinating things that I think of this instrument is that it has one foot in the contemporary age, so to say, and one in the past. As I mentioned, this instrument did not survive, so the kind of instrument that we reconstruct is a modern fantasy to a great extent. And so in my contact with this instrument, I think sound exploration with the instrument is fascinating. It allows to create a huge range of things with the limitations that it has. For example, I play only with one hand, so as a keyboard player, instead of playing with two hands, I can only play the keys with one hand.
Because you have to pump the bellows with the other hand.
Exactly. But at the same time, I have basically my whole being in front of the pipes. And most importantly, it's me who operates the wind, which is the source of the sound, changes the tuning, changes the dynamics. You can do all sorts of effects with the bellows. So I commissioned a few pieces to different composers for this recording. I also composed my own pieces for the different medieval organs. And yeah, I'm continuing to work with new composers and composing more for this instrument.
Catalina Vicens is my guest. We're talking about medieval pipe organs. She'll be playing one alongside the three female vocalists of Trio Mediæval on Sunday, March 16th at Town Hall, Seattle. Performance is at 2 p.m. It's part of Early Music Seattle's Spring Festival. The program is called An Old Hall Ladymass, which is also the title of a recent album by Trio Mediæval. What can we expect to hear in that concert?
Yes, so we're going to be hearing polyphonic music mostly from the late Middle Ages in England. So this is a wonderful manuscript where Trio Mediæval
The manuscript is the Old Hall Manuscript. That's the reference.
Exactly.
Named for a town in England, one of the few sources for this music that survived Henry VIII.
Exactly. So it's a treasure of a manuscript, and so there's in the concert there's going to be lots of a cappella liturgical music from this manuscript, and at the same time I'm joining them in some of these liturgical pieces with the organ. But my primary function there is to improvise and create bridges, because Trio Mediæval is also performing in this program some a cappella pieces that are contemporary pieces.
By David Lang, among others.
Exactly. And this is wonderful because that gives me the liberty to improvise and have also some of my pieces there in between the voices, creating a line and transitions and developing also the language that goes from medieval modality into a newer language.
Were women allowed to sing this music in pre-Reformation England?
They were, but they were usually not visible. Women were singing well into the later centuries after Reformation in Catholicism, but of course it's much less documented.
Now, this music was largely forgotten for hundreds of years, wasn't it? It wasn't until after World War II that performances of early music really became a thing.
Yes, so there was reflourishing, a renaissance of medieval music. And today, I would say medieval music is widely consumed in different ways, going from more pop culture, what comes in sometimes some tunes come into fantasy movies and games and things like that, into establishing courses in conservatories and music schools of high professionals into this world. So it's wonderful.
And yet, with no recordings, no continuous performance history, and with only the rudimentary notation of the time to go on, how do we know what this music really sounded like?
We have no idea. So we do have certain parameters, but of course, I mean, there are certain documentations that speak about sound aesthetics, but they are very few and very isolated. So creating a picture of what, in this case, would be the whole of Europe and a shared repertoire with beyond Europe, because we're talking about a type of musical language modality that was shared between different religions, different types of culture, the influence of the Arabic culture in for so many centuries in Europe. That common language creates an array of um, exchange that we don't have also a very clear aesthetic. It's dangerous to say what we hear today from other cultures is that what would have been sung by that same culture or performed by the same culture thousands of years ago.
Right?
So it is a complex thing. And while I say that, the reconstructions of instruments do bring us in a way to certain aspects of music that will give us lots of information. For example, there were no bass instruments or almost no bass instruments, and most of the instruments that we know existed were very highly pitched.
Why was that?
That must have been part of an aesthetic. So it takes a lot of rethinking of what we see in the surviving music scores that are lots of them. There's so many manuscripts of medieval music. Um,
Might the availability of materials have had something to do with that? It takes more wood, more metal, whatever, to build a bass instrument.
It could have to do with the strings and so on, but I think it is largely due to more than technology to aesthetics. But of course, they are always in hand. They were able to produce large organs, which one would think they are the most sophisticated machines in the instrumentarium most of the time. But they still decided to do lots of these very small, probably very high-pitched sounding instruments. Fiddles, we don't have documentation of gambas, basically. They were mostly handheld fiddles with a range that basically don't cover the low notes that we would consider today a bass instrument.
If we could transport one of these early composers to the concert on March 16th, do you think they would recognize the music?
I have no clue, but I'm sure that they would be absolutely fascinated.
And I'm sure we'll be fascinated as well. My guest, Catalina Vicens, performing with Trio Mediæval next Sunday afternoon, March 16th at Town Hall, Seattle. Concert starts at 2 p.m. The program is entitled An Old Hall Ladymass. It's part of Early Music Seattle's 2025 Spring Festival. Tickets and information are available at earlymusicseattle.org. Let's hear one more organ solo by Catalina Vicens from her Organic Creatures album. This is a very old selection, an organum by Perotin. When and where does this come from?
So we are in France during the Notre Dame school in the between the 11th and 12th centuries.
Named for the cathedral that was being constructed at that time. music designed for a highly reverberant space.
Yes.
Here is Catalina Vicens, followed by Trio Mediæval on Flotation Device.